The stars in the Helios Corridor did not move. They never moved. They hung in the black abyss like cold flames, millions of leagues apart, indifferent to everything that passed between them. There was no sound, no wind, nothing but the slow, infinite silence of deep space. It was in this silence that Fleet Admiral Yak stood on the bridge of his flagship and, for the first time in many years, felt something akin to pleasure. He was tall, even by Bredh standards. His skin was the color of slate after rain, a dark, gray blue that thickened at his joints and along his jawline. His eyes were wide and pale, almost white, the kind of eyes that had seen much and found most of it unworthy of close attention. He had 4 arms, like all Bredh, and he kept the lower pair folded behind his back, a habit so old it had become part of how he was recognized from afar. With his upper pair, he gestured, issuing commands. He had been commanding for a long time, 31 years in the Dominion of Bredh armed forces. 11 systems had been brought under Dominion control. 3 species had been brought to their knees, and 2 more had been wiped out entirely because knees were not part of their nature. He had never lost a single engagement, not once, not even the minor ones other admirals dismissed as routine. He treated every skirmish the same way he had treated the first one when he was young, unknown, and golden, with complete focus, with absolute intent. Now, he stood on the bridge of the Infinite Dominion, his 700-meter flagship with a crew of 4,000 Bredh soldiers and officers, and stared through the forward viewport at a single human ship drifting in the dark. It did not move. It sat in space like a stone at the bottom of a river, passive, motionless. Its navigation lights blinked slowly in a dull amber rhythm, almost lazy in its consistency. The ship was long and angular, built without the curves preferred by most Bredh vessels, all flat panels and sharp edges, as if someone had decided that beauty was not a military requirement. It was painted a dark gray that made it difficult to detect against the black of space unless you were looking for it. Was Yak looking? He had been looking for it for 6 hours. His armada had picked up the vessel's energy signature at the edge of the Helios Corridor 3 days ago. And for those 3 days, he had been running calculations. The corridor was a patch of space the Dominion of Bredh considered theirs by right of proximity, though no formal boundary had been established. Humanity. That young, clumsy species, which had only discovered faster-than-light travel in the last 80 years of its short life, had apparently decided to run a ship through it without permission. Typical, Yak thought when the report first hit his desk. Young species always did this. They did not understand the rules because they had not yet been taught the rules. That was fine. Teaching was something the Bredh were very good at. He had brought 7 ships. Not because he expected a fight, he did not, but because 7 ships sent a message more clearly than 2. He wanted the humans to understand, the moment they saw his armada emerging from FTL, exactly what situation they were in. He wanted the math to be obvious. 1 of them, 7 of us. Go home. But the human ship did not fly away when his armada appeared. It did not raise shields. It did not charge weapons, or at least, the passive energy readings his scouts received indicated no weapon charging. It just kept drifting, blinking its lights, doing absolutely nothing. Yak waited. He was patient. He could wait. The ship continued to do nothing. He sent a standard hailing frequency, the one the Bredh used with all new species. A mathematical sequence, followed by a greeting in the 3 dominant, then a request for identification strictly professional. It gave the other side a chance to answer so that shooting wouldn't be necessary. The reply came in one of those galactic languages, spoken with a human accent that was slightly flat and clipped. A calm voice. Female, he supposed. She identified the ship as the U.S. Iron Meridian, a warship of the United Earth Sovereignty. She acknowledged the presence of the Dominion of Bredh. She expressed no concern. That was when Yak decided to conduct a deep scan. It was standard procedure. Before boarding a vessel, which he planned to do, as a lone human ship in territory claimed by the Bredh was technically a violation giving him full authority to act, he always performed a full scan. He wanted to know what he was dealing with. He wanted to know the ship's power levels, its weapon systems, crew count, structural weaknesses. It made the boarding cleaner. It made everything more efficient. He called for his lead sensor analyst, Prith. Prith was not a soldier. He was a technician, which in the Bredh military hierarchy put him several rungs below officers and commanders, but several above the repair crews. He was younger than most on the bridge, with a narrower build earned by years spent at a console rather than training in physical readiness programs. His eyes were darker than Yak's, almost dark blue. And they moved quickly, constantly processing, constantly reading. He was the best scanner operator in the fleet, and that was the only reason Yak tolerated his occasional habit of asking questions before executing orders. Prith, without comment, deployed the deep scan array. He understood what was required of him. He pushed the power consumption of the arrays to full capacity, aligned the sensor clusters with the drifting human ship, and began the process. Deep scanning was not like a simple radar survey. It did not just bounce a signal off a surface and measure what returned. It pushed focused energy through the ship's hull in waves. Each wave was tuned to a different frequency. Each was designed to reveal a different type of information. Hull composition, internal structure, power systems, signs of life, ammunition count, engine configuration. In essence, it was a total and complete examination of everything the ship was and what it contained. It took time. For a vessel the size of the Iron Meridian, a thorough deep scan would take 20 to 30 minutes. Prith started a timer and watched his screens. Second-in-command Virax stood a few meters away, watching Prith work. Virax was older than most of the bridge crew, with the thick neck and heavy jaw of a man who had gone through ground combat before moving to fleet service. He wasn't a thinker like Prith, but he was sharp and noticed things others missed. For instance, he noticed that the human ship didn't react at all when the scan array powered up. Most vessels, even friendly ones, registered some reaction to a deep scan. It was like being stared at in a room full of people. Usually, you felt it. The Iron Meridian didn't seem to feel it. Or, as Virax thought, it felt it, but simply didn't care. He kept that thought to himself. Yak did not like unnecessary comments during operations. On the bridge of the Infinite Dominion, Commander Alar Voss sat in her command chair, listening to her ship breathe. Every ship had its own sound. The sound of the Iron Meridian was a low, constant vibration that traveled through the chair, through the floor, through the walls. The sound of 3 fusion reactors idling, the sound of life support systems running, the sound of nearly 2,000 people performing their duties with discipline, the calm routine that usually developed during long service in deep space. It was a sound Voss had lived with for 11 years on various ships and found more comforting than silence. She was not a tall woman. She was average height for a human, more slender than broad, with dark brown skin and short-cropped natural hair that she kept neat because regulations required it and because she never liked fussing with it. Her eyes were a perfectly ordinary brown. She was 43. She had a face that gave little away, not because she was hiding anything, but because she had long ago learned that a commander's facial expression was something the crew constantly monitored, and there was no sense in frightening people with her uncertainty. She had been watching the Bredh Armada since it dropped out of FTL 6 hours ago, 7 ships. She counted them carefully. She performed her own passive scans, nothing that could provoke them. Just standard electromagnetic readings that any ship did automatically, and she built a picture of what she was looking at. The Bredh flagship alone was nearly 4 times the length of the Iron Meridian. The 6 escort vessels were roughly equal to her ship in size, perhaps a bit larger. All 7 were armed. All 7 had their weapon systems in standby mode. Not fully charged, but not fully cooled. Ready, but waiting. She had received a hail and responded to it. She kept her voice level and her words simple. She gave her ship's name and her government's name and did not ask what the Bredh wanted, because it was perfectly obvious what they wanted. They wanted her to leave. She was not going to leave. Her orders were specific. She was in the Helios Corridor because Admiral Harkin had sent her there intentionally. The Bredh had been slowly, cautiously expanding their claimed territories over the last decade, pushing their borders a little further each year into space that no formal treaty had assigned to anyone. They did it quietly, one system at a time, waiting to see if anyone would push back. Most species did not. Most species saw the size of the Bredh Dominion and decided the corridor, system, or planet wasn't worth the fight. Harkin had decided it was time to push back, not with aggression, not with a declaration, but simply with presence. With the physical fact of a human warship sitting in space the Bredh had been quietly occupying, not moving when asked, and then allowing them to scan it. That part of the order had surprised Voss when Harkin first gave it. She was sitting across from the Admiral in his office on Earth Station 1, listening to him lay out the mission. And when he reached the part about allowing a full deep scan without raising shields or initiating any countermeasures, she said simply and clearly, "Sir, That will show them everything." Harkin looked at her for a moment before answering. He was a large man, elderly, with silver in his hair and the kind of calm that comes from making very difficult decisions over a long career. He nodded slowly and said, "Yes, that is the point." She wanted to ask more questions. She had about 6 of them ready to tumble off her tongue. But something in the way he said it, the complete, unhurried confidence of it, made her close her mouth and think about it for a moment. And the longer she thought about it, the more she began to understand. The Bredh had spent 3 centuries building a reputation. Reputation was a weapon. You didn't need to fight every species. You just needed to make sure every species knew what happened to the ones you had fought. Reputation did the rest. Humanity was building a reputation too, just of a different kind. Voss opened the ship-wide channel. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The system carried sound perfectly. She said, "Let them look at everything." And then she leaned back in her chair and listened to her ship breathe and waited. On the Infinite Dominion, the deep scan continued. Data moved across Prith's screens in slow, steady columns. First, the results of the hull analysis. This was always the fastest layer to read. Prith had performed such scans on dozens of vessels throughout his career, from tiny mining ships to full-scale military cruisers. He knew what numbers usually looked like. He knew the standard ranges. He looked at the first set of numbers coming from the Iron Meridian's hull analysis. He looked at them for a long time. He performed a calibration check on his instruments because he was a careful technician. And the first thing you do when you get a number that doesn't meet expectations is to check if your instruments are working properly. The calibration check came up clean. The instruments were fine. He looked at the numbers again. They were not fine. He didn't say anything yet. He was a technician, not an officer. He wasn't supposed to say anything until he had more data. He flagged the hull analysis results and moved to the next layer of the scan, telling himself there was likely an explanation, that the numbers were unusual but not necessarily alarming, that he should wait for the full picture before drawing conclusions. He moved to the weapon system data, and the next set of numbers began to arrive. He placed another flag. Verax, observing from a few meters away, saw a small, barely perceptible change in Prith's posture. The technician's back straightened slightly. His lower pair of hands, which had been resting loosely on the edge of the console, squeezed their fingers inward, barely noticeably, so that most people wouldn't have seen it. Verax noticed. He stepped one step closer and looked at Prith's screen. And although he wasn't a scanner specialist and the data on the screen wasn't presented in a way immediately clear to him, he saw the flags accumulating in the corner of the display. 1, 2, now 3. He looked through the viewport at the human ship. It was still drifting, still calm, still doing nothing. Yak stood by the forward viewport, watching his armada's positioning on a secondary display. 6 of his ships were positioned in a loose arc around the human vessel, not a full encirclement, but enough to non-aggressively convey the nature of the situation. It was a posture he had used many times. It said, "You are surrounded. You are outgunned. Make the right decision." He wasn't watching Prith's screens. The scan continued. He would review the results when they were complete, as he always did, thoroughly and in an orderly fashion. He believed in the proper sequence of actions. He didn't immediately notice that Prith had become very quiet. The scan continued. The data flowed, and with each new layer of information, the deep scan array extracted from the bones of the Iron Meridian, Prith's hands became more motionless. The flags in the corner of his screen multiplied, and a cold sensation that had started at the base of his neck moved slowly up to the back of his head. He reached the biological indicators, the data on signs of life, the crew metrics, and the cold sensation reached his eyes. The scan showed 1,847 people aboard the Iron Meridian. It showed their location inside the ship, their movement patterns, basic physiological data. And because Prith's scanner array was a military system designed to assess threats, it also measured something else: hormonal and neurological markers associated with stress. In all other species Prith had ever scanned during a military standoff, these markers looked a certain way. Fear, panic, the biology of a creature that knows it is in danger and is trying to decide whether to run or fight. It was readable, it was predictable, it was in a strange sense comforting because it meant the other side understood the situation just as you did. The human readings did not look like that. 1,847 people, surrounded by 7 Bredh warships, being scanned deeply without their permission, on a ship sitting alone in the dark, millions of miles away from anyone who could help them, and their biological indicators showed something that Prith's scanner system could not classify. He stared at the readings. The system was trying to classify them, running them through every category in its database. Fear no match. Panic no match. Aggression no match. Exhaustion no match. Chemical sedation no match. The system went through its entire library. Then it stopped and displayed 2 words in the output field. Classification unknown. Prith sat very quietly for a moment. Then he turned to find the Admiral. "Fleet Admiral," he said. His voice sounded lower than he intended, and with a slight tremor he hadn't planned and couldn't fully explain. Yak turned away from the viewport. He saw the expression on Prith's face, the careful, controlled expression of a technician who had found something he didn't know how to explain, and he crossed the bridge in long, measured strides. He looked at the screen. The bridge of the Infinite Dominion, under normal circumstances, was not a quiet place. Dozens of officers and crew were at their stations, monitoring systems, running calculations, communicating with the rest of the armada. There was always sound, always movement. Yak read the screen, then read it again, and then he froze, very quietly. And somehow, the silence of one man changed the atmosphere of the entire room. People noticed. They always noticed when the Admiral froze, slowly, without a command. The bridge became quieter. Through the viewport, the Iron Meridian continued to drift, steady and calm. Its amber navigation lights blinked in that slow, unhurried rhythm as if it had nowhere else to rush to. And there was no reason to rush, as if it were waiting for them to finish. As if it had known even before the scan started exactly what they would find and exactly what they would feel when they found it. Virax walked up to the Admiral and looked at the screen. He read the numbers, he read the flags, he read the 2 words in the output field. He said nothing. He looked at the human ship. The scan wasn't complete yet. There were still a few layers to go. Still a lot of data to be received. For the first time in 14 years of fleet service, Second-in-Command Virax found he wasn't quite sure he wanted to see what would happen next. The scan continued. Prith remained at his console. He hadn't moved from his seat for over 20 minutes, which was unusual for him, as he was the type of person who fidgeted, fussed, leaned forward and backward when he thought. But now, he didn't fidget. He sat very straight and still. His 4 hands rested neatly on the edge of the console, and he read the results as they arrived, the same way a person might read something they hoped would change if they looked at it long enough. It didn't change. Fleet Admiral Yak pulled a chair from a neighboring station and placed it next to Prith's console. He didn't usually sit at a scanning station. He usually stood by the forward viewport or on the command platform in the center of the bridge. But the forward viewport didn't show him anything useful, and the command platform currently seemed like the wrong place to be. He wanted to see the numbers as they arrived. He wanted to see every layer of data as the scan revealed it in real time. Without waiting for a summary, he asked Prith to walk through it, to explain each section as it arrived in plain language, without technical jargon. Prith nodded and began. The first to come were the results of the hull analysis, and Prith explained them quietly. His voice was careful and measured the voice of a person methodically trying not to put emotion into his words. The outer hull of the Iron Meridian was not made of one material. Most ships used one primary alloy, perhaps 2, in areas where extra strength was required. The human ship used 17 different materials. They were all interconnected at a structural level. Each was chosen because of how it interacted with the others. Some were standard metals and composites that the Bredh recognized. Others didn't exist in any Bredh material database. What the scan could determine from how the materials reacted to the scanner's test frequencies was that the outer hull was not passive armor. It didn't just sit there and absorb hits. The outer layer, a composite the scan couldn't fully classify, reacted to energy input. When the deep scan frequencies passed through it, the material absorbed part of that energy and redirected it inward, not randomly, but in a specific direction toward the ship's power plant. Yak looked at Prith when this result came in. Prith looked at him with the same careful, controlled expression. "It eats weapon hits," Prith said, because there was no simpler way to say it, or at least part of it. The directed energy hitting the outer layer doesn't just bounce off or damage the hull. Part of it is absorbed, and then the hull transfers it to the ship's power systems. Yak said nothing. He looked at the numbers for a long time, then gestured for Prith to continue. The second layer of the scan covered the internal structure of the ship, the frame, the bulkheads, the way the ship was assembled from the inside. Prith ran this analysis twice, because the first run produced results that seemed incompatible with what the outer scanner had shown, and he wanted to ensure he wasn't misreading the data. He hadn't been misreading. The Iron Meridian was divided inside into sections that were individually isolated from each other at a structural level, and not just doors that could close. Real physical separation. Each section of the ship could be completely isolated from all other sections if the situation required it. The materials of the internal bulkheads differed from the composite of the outer hull but shared one common characteristic. The scan suggested they were capable of a limited degree of self-repair. Prith explained this part slowly because he understood that what he was saying sounded like something from a story, not an engineering report. The hull could, under certain conditions, seal small breaches on its own. Small damage. A significant weapon strike would still cause significant damage. But the kind of small breaches that accumulate during a long battle, small cracks and fatigue fractures that add up over time and eventually become critical vulnerabilities, the material could deal with them slowly and on its own, while the ship was still fighting. Yak asked how that was possible. Prith said he didn't know for sure. The scan could tell him what the material was doing. It couldn't tell him with complete certainty exactly how. He could say that the structure was unlike anything in Bredh engineering. It wasn't that the Bredh hadn't thought of self-repairing materials. They had theoretical papers, laboratory experiments, but the practical difficulties were immense, and the Bredh had concluded several decades ago that the technology was too complex and expensive for widespread use. Humans apparently had come to a different conclusion. Second-in-command Verax had by now walked over and stood behind them. He hadn't been invited, but Yak hadn't told him to leave, which meant he was allowed to stay. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest, reading the screen over Prith's shoulder, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Next was the weapon data. Prith paused before starting this section. A small pause, barely perceptible, like a sigh. Then he straightened his back a little more and began to read the numbers. The Iron Meridian carried 32 primary guns, mass driver cannons, arranged in 8 batteries of 4 along the ship's main axis and on the side flanks. The scan measured barrel length, power consumption of the electromagnetic coils, capacity of ammunition storage systems. And based on these measurements, a performance forecast was calculated. Prith read the performance forecast. Then he read it again. Then he said, very quietly, each gun can accelerate a 1-ton tungsten projectile to approximately 4% of the speed of light. Yak said, repeat. Prith repeated, 4% of the speed of light. That wasn't the speed at which weapons were supposed to travel. That wasn't the speed at which weapons could practically travel. Given the engineering developments involved in the acceleration process, given the power requirements, given the structural loads on the barrel and the ship's hull during firing, the Bredh's own mass driver technology considered advanced worked at a fraction of that speed. Their best weapons moved projectiles at roughly 0.5% of the speed of light. And that required immense energy expenditures and had a low rate of fire because the systems needed time to recover between shots. The human cannons, if the scanner forecast was correct, fired at 8 times that speed. Prith demonstrated the calculations aloud because math made things feel more real and manageable than raw numbers, and also because he needed to do something with his hands and his voice while his mind tried to calm down. At 4% of the speed of light, a 1-ton tungsten projectile carried kinetic energy measured in the equivalent of many thousands of nuclear warheads. One shot from one gun. The Iron Meridian had 32 of them. The total kinetic output of one broadside volley from the Iron Meridian, if all guns fired simultaneously, would significantly exceed the total firepower of Yak's entire 7-ship armada. Verax made a sound. It wasn't a word. It was just the sound that escapes a person when their mind tries to process something and briefly exhausts its capabilities. Yak didn't make a sound. He sat very quietly and stared at the screen. And then he said, "Power source. The power source." Prith nodded. He had already moved to this section of the scan. 3 fusion reactors, he said, each independent of the others. If one is destroyed, the remaining 2 will not lose power. They will increase power output and automatically redistribute the load. Switching time, approximately 1 second. 1 second in battle. 1 second. That is nothing. In 1 second, a ship either won, lost, or was dead. And a 1-second vulnerability in the power system was, for all practical purposes, no vulnerability at all. Each reactor can support the weapon system at full firepower indefinitely, Prith continued. Several shots, an unlimited combat window. Unlimited, as long as there is reactor fuel, which, according to the scanner's estimate, he checked the number twice, approximately 4 years of continuous combat operation. No one on the bridge said a word. For a while, the background sounds of the ship continued, the hum of systems, the quiet tones of instruments, the distant movement of crew in other parts of the vessel. But in the immediate space around Yak's chair and Prith's console, a silence reigned, separate from all of that. A focused, concentrated silence. Prith moved on. He had more to cover. Part of the biological data had been revealed earlier. Crew count, strange hormonal readings, the result classification unknown. Now, the full biological report was finished, and Prith went through it in the same careful, methodical way he had gone through everything else. 1,847 people. Their distribution inside the ship showed that the crew was at battle stations, not at rest stations, not on regular duty rotations, but in a configuration associated with a fully deployed and ready-to-act crew. Every weapon station was manned. Every engineering post was occupied. The bridge crew was full. Damage control groups were placed at predetermined response points throughout the ship. This was a crew ready for battle. And yet, the hormonal readings said they were calm, not under the influence of drugs, not forcedly calm, just calm. The scanner's bioanalysis system was designed to assess threat levels by measuring biological markers of stress. High stress meant a crew that was reactive, unpredictable, prone to error. Low stress in a non-combat situation was normal. Low stress in a situation like this surrounded, outgunned. Being deeply scanned without consent should not have existed. Human stress markers were low. Their neurological activity was elevated, which corresponded to focus and awareness. But the markers of fear, the specific biological signals that every known species produces when facing mortal danger, were minimal. Present, but minimal. A low-level biological readiness that was closer to athletic preparation than to panic. They were treating this, as their biological indicators suggested, the way a human treats something they have prepared for and are ready for. Prith looked at these readings for a moment before moving on. He went to the final section of the scan, the one that had taken the longest to process because the scanning system encountered materials that required additional time for analysis, the sealed lower decks. The Iron Meridian had a section of its lower hull that was shielded differently than the rest of the ship, not with the outer composite, but with something else, denser, something that the scanner required several passes to fully penetrate. The protection itself told a story. Everything inside those lower decks was something the ship's designers had specifically decided to protect from external observation. The scanner eventually managed to penetrate. Prith read the list of contents. Then he placed his hands on the console and took a slow breath. The sealed lower decks contained an armory, not a standard weapons storage compartment. The Iron Meridian's standard ammunition was accounted for elsewhere. This was a secondary weapons stockpile, separate from the ship's main weapon systems, and it contained warheads, non-standard warheads, not nuclear devices or the antimatter charges the Bredh used, and most militaries in the known galaxy had developed. This was something else. The scan determined the physical structure and energy signature, and Prith's instruments compared them with all known weapon classifications in the Dominion's database. No match. What the scan could determine was that the energy contained in these warheads was significant, extremely significant. The type of energy signature that, in the Bredh's own theoretical physics research with which Prith was superficially familiar because he had studied advanced physics before joining the military, was associated with a type of spatial destruction weapon. A weapon that didn't just destroy matter, but interfered with the physical structure of space itself in the local area. The Bredh had theorized about such weapons. A few papers had been written. The general scientific consensus was that while the principle was correct, the technology required to miniaturize such a device to the size of a deliverable warhead was beyond current engineering capabilities. Perhaps in a century it would become practical, perhaps longer. The Iron Meridian carried 47 of them. Prith stopped. He sat at his console and looked at his screen and said nothing for a time because he had run out of careful, methodical, controlled ways to present the information, and he needed a minute to find them again. Yak was also looking at the screen. His pale eyes slowly slid across the data. His expression hadn't changed. It was still that flat, controlled look that had made him famous throughout the Dominion. The look that said he was processing information and hadn't yet made a decision, but something had changed around his eyes. Something that wasn't quite an expression, but was in that territory. Tension, silence after silence. Verax stopped crossing his arms. He dropped them to his sides, and his hands were slightly open, the posture of a man who had unconsciously let go of a confident stance because the confidence had gone somewhere else. The scan was finished. The full report was on Prith's screen, organized into neat columns and categories that the system always used. Everything was formatted with the clean, professional layout of a military intelligence document. Hull composition, internal structure, weapon systems, power plants, crew biometrics, secondary armament. It all added up to a picture Prith hadn't expected to see when he started this scan 30 minutes ago. He had expected a primitive ship. He had expected numbers that were behind Bredh technology. He had expected to write a scan report that confirmed what everyone already assumed, that this human ship was smaller, weaker, less capable, and that its presence in the corridor was a mistake by a young species that didn't know its place in the hierarchy of galactic power. He had expected to feel relief after the scan. He didn't feel relief. The bridge of the infinite dominion was now quiet. The background sounds were still there. The ship continued to operate, to function. All its systems were still doing what they were supposed to do, but the people at the scanning station weren't making any sounds of their own. They were just there, in that silence, looking at the screen or looking at the human ship through the viewport or looking at each other. Prith thought about the result, classification unknown regarding the crew's stress levels. He thought about the 1,847 people sitting in that ship, calm and ready, who had allowed the scan to happen. They were clearly told, let the Bredh look at everything. They knew what the scan would show. They knew what it would show, and they allowed it to happen anyway. He thought about what that meant. If you allow someone to see your full strength, all of it, every layer, every weapon, every capability, there are really only two reasons to do so. Either you are making a mistake and don't realize how much you are showing, or you are showing it intentionally because you want the other side to know, because you want them to feel what Prith was feeling right now. He turned to look at Fleet Admiral Yak, the conqueror of 11 systems, the man who had never lost a single battle, who had brought 3 species to their knees and erased 2 more, who had arrived in this corridor with 7 ships because 1 human ship, lonely in the dark, seemed like a simple problem. Yak was still looking at the screen. He wasn't giving orders. In 31 years, as Prith imagined, the Admiral had always given orders quickly after a scan. Assess, decide, act. That was the way of the Bredh military. That was Yak's way, especially since he wasn't a man who hesitated. Now, he was hesitating. Prith looked at his screen again, at the report, at the numbers, at the 2 words in the corner of the biological analysis section, classification unknown. Outside the viewport, the Iron Meridian continued to drift. The amber lights blinked steadily and slowly, waiting with that terrible patience as if it had all the time in the universe and knew exactly how this would end. Yak stood up. He did it slowly, as a man stands who needs to move but hasn't yet decided where to go. He walked away from Prith's console. He walked to the forward viewport and stood in front of it, folding his lower pair of arms behind his back, his upper pair at his sides, and looked at the Iron Meridian. It looked the same as it had for the last few hours, drifting, still blinking its navigation lights. He stood there for nearly 3 minutes, saying nothing, and no one on the bridge said anything either, because the Admiral was thinking, and the whole room knew it. And when Yak was thinking, you stayed quiet and waited. Then he turned away from the viewport and looked at his intelligence officer, Lieutenant Sot, a slender Bredh woman who managed the flagship's intelligence department with such quiet efficiency that she was easy to overlook and very difficult to replace. She stood at her station to the left of the bridge, watching the Admiral just like everyone else. Everything we have. On the humans, Yak said. Everything. Pull it up now. Sot nodded and got to work. It took her 11 minutes to compile a full intelligence file on humanity. 11 minutes, because the Dominion had not invested massive resources in gathering intel on a species that had only been exploring space for 80 years, and which everyone assumed posed no strategic threat for at least another century. The file was there. It wasn't as thick as files on species that actually caused the Bredh trouble. She displayed the file on the main display in the center of the bridge where everyone could see, and she walked the Admiral through it. The first section, history, human history. As much as the Bredh had managed to gather from intercepted messages, from the databases of other species that had contacted Earth before the Bredh, and from a small number of direct information exchanges that had occurred during the early period of human space expansion. Yak read. He read carefully, as he read everything not skimming through headlines, but moving methodically, absorbing every part before moving to the next. Human civilization, the file stated, numbered roughly 10,000 years by their own calendar, 10,000 years from the first permanent settlements to the present day. The Dominion of Bredh, by comparison, had a documented history of roughly 6,000 years. The Bredh considered themselves an ancient species, mature, experienced, having learned over those 6,000 years about organization, management, and power projection in space. 10,000 years of human history. Yak read about what filled those 10,000 years. War, not accidental war. Not the undisciplined strategic military campaigns the Bredh fought when expansion required it. Constant war, relentless, inventive, constantly escalating war between human groups, human nations, human ideologies, human religions, human economic systems. War waged with stones, then metal, then explosives, then weapons that could, if used in sufficient quantity, destroy all life on their planet. They developed this last weapon. The file was clear on this point. Humanity developed devices capable of planetary destruction and aimed them at each other. They lived a significant portion of their recent history in a state where total extinction of their species was one wrong decision away, and then they didn't destroy themselves. Not because they suddenly became peaceful. The file was clear on this point too. They didn't cease to be a species producing conflict, competition, and a readiness to apply force. They just, and this was the word Sot used when she summarized this section, redirected. Internal conflicts didn't disappear. They changed shape. And the energy, the drive, the immense collective power of a species that had spent 10,000 years finding ways to defeat, outwit, and survive enemies, that power was directed outward, into space. Continue, Yak said. The second section of the file covered the development of human armed forces since they achieved FTL 80 years ago. The Bredh, during those 80 years, had mostly ignored humanity as a problem for future generations. Other intelligence services in other empires had done the same. The file contained notes from 3 separate Bredh intelligence assessments conducted over the last 50 years. All of them concluded that humanity's military potential was developing, but slowly, and that their technology was significantly behind Dominion standards. The most recent of these assessments was 12 years old. Yak looked at the date for a moment. 12 years. He hadn't ordered a new one because the situation didn't seem urgent enough to require it. Humanity was young. It would take time for them to develop. There was no rush. He thought about what humanity had apparently managed to do in 12 years. The third section covered the Iron Meridian specifically. Not just the ship itself, but its class, the Vanguard class. The Dominion knew of this class's existence. They had intercepted enough messages to know the name. What they didn't know, or didn't consider a priority to find out, was the number of units produced. Sot read the number from the file. Her voice was level and professional, the kind of voice one uses when one has decided this is a job and one is going to perform it well, regardless of how the information is received. The Iron Meridian, hull number 412 inches, the Vanguard class. Yak looked at her. She looked back with the same level, careful expression of a person who had already processed the consequences and was now waiting for the person in charge to do the same. 412 ships. 412 vessels of the same class as the one sitting outside, with the same hull composition, the same weapon system, the same triple redundant reactors, the same impossible kinetic output per volley. And those were only the ones that had been built. The file suggested that production was ongoing. The exact current number was unknown because the Dominion's intel on human shipyard capacities was incomplete, but 412 was the minimum. Verax, still standing behind Yak, was very quiet. Yak didn't need to look at him to know it. He felt the silence in the room behind him. Classification levels, Yak said. Above Vanguard. What do we have? Sot pulled up the corresponding section. The Dominion's file on the classification of human armed forces was incomplete. They hadn't paid enough attention for long enough to build a full picture. But from intercepted messages and data provided by other species that had watched humanity's development more closely than the Bredh, they had identified 4 distinct classification levels above Vanguard. Vanguard was not their best warship. Vanguard was a mid-range ship for patrol and escort. Above it were 4 classes. The file contained incomplete data on 2 of them. About the other 2, they knew almost nothing except their names and the fact of their existence. Yak walked back to the viewport. He stood there and looked at the Iron Meridian and thought about the mid-range. He thought about that word in the specific sense that a military commander thinks about information that changes the fundamental nature of a situation. He was a man who dealt in realities. He didn't comfort himself with hopeful interpretations. He dealt with what was, and what was this. He had brought 7 ships to intimidate a lone human patrol ship, and the patrol ship was a mid-range asset. He thought about what a non-mid-range human ship might look like and decided, after a moment, that he would prefer not to find out the hard way. On the Iron Meridian, in the hours after the scan, Commander Alar Vos received a short message from Admiral Harkin via a secured relay. It had been passed through 3 intermediate stations to keep the signal profile low. It contained only one word: scan complete. Any reaction from the Bredh? Vos replied, none yet. Waiting. Harkin's next message came in a few minutes later. It said, good. Let them think. Give them time. They will come to the right conclusion themselves if given the space for it. Vos read this message, then looked at the Bredh Armada and thought about the mission briefing, about where she had asked Harkin why they would let an enemy see everything. And Harkin had replied that the best weapon wasn't on the ship. She had thought about that answer a lot since then. During the transit to the Helios Corridor, in the quiet hours before the Bredh Armada arrived, she had sat in her briefing room and pondered it, analyzing it the way you analyze a decision you were tasked to make for someone else, looking for the part you disagree with. She hadn't found it. The logic was clear. The Bredh acted on reputation. They had built their empire on it. The reputation of overwhelming force, of undeniable consequences, of a hierarchy that had a clear and predictable top. When you encountered the Bredh, you knew exactly how much worse your situation could get. That knowledge was a weapon. It made most species surrender before the first shot. Humanity was building a different reputation, not the reputation of a species that destroys everything it touches. The reputation of a species that had very carefully thought about what power it possessed, developed significantly more than anyone expected, and this was the key part Harkin had explained with that quiet confidence of his, didn't show its maximum always kept something in reserve. You can fight a known quantity. You can plan against a specific level of threat. You can calculate whether you can win against a force you have fully measured. You cannot plan against an unknown upper limit. If every time you look at humanity's military forces, you see something larger and more capable than you expected, then the question will never be, can we defeat what we see? The question will become, how much more is there that we don't see? That question, once lodged in the head, was very hard to get out. Vos understood it in the briefing room on Earth Station 1, sitting across from Harkin. But now she understood it differently. She understood it the way you understand a thing when it is actually happening, not when it is being explained. She understood it in the silence coming from the Bredh Armada, in the fact that none of their guns had charged since the scan was completed, in the fact that they just sat there. 7 large and powerful ships, doing nothing. She told her crew to remain on alert, not to relax. She wasn't naive, but to ease the tension, to eat, to rotate rest shifts, to take care of the human things the crew needed to take care of during a long standoff. She didn't want her people to be exhausted and nervous when the real conversation started, because the conversation would come. She was almost sure of it. Now, on the Iron Meridian, there were 1,847 people, and these people were part of those who had trained together for a long time and understood each other well, very good at reading the mood of a situation. They had been watching the Bredh Armada since its arrival. They noticed the scan. They noticed the long silence after the scan. They knew what that silence meant, not because they were told, but because humans were a species that had spent 10,000 years reading silence and understanding what it meant in the context of power and danger and decision-making. Silence meant the Bredh were scared, not panicked, not broken, but scared in exactly the way a very powerful thing is scared when it encounters something stronger than it expected. And it has to decide what to do about it. Most of the crew didn't celebrate this. They didn't congratulate each other. They just continued performing their duties with a slight relaxation in their eyes and jaws, the biological equivalent of an exhale. It meant that the worst-case scenario looked less likely than an hour ago. A young weapons systems officer named Dario quietly asked his superior officer if they would have to fight. The senior officer, an older woman named Chen, who had served in deep space for 16 years, looked at the Bredh Armada for a moment before answering. "No," she said, "I don't think so." "How do you know?" "Because they stopped moving," Chen said. A species that has decided to fight doesn't stop and sit for this long. They are figuring out what they are going to say to us. Dario thought about that. What will they say? Chen shrugged. It doesn't much matter, does it? The important conversation has already taken place. Back on the Infinite Dominion, the important conversation was indeed still continuing, just not out loud. Yak dismissed most of the crew from secondary positions. He kept Prith, Virax, and Sot. He needed thinkers, not soldiers. He needed people who could help him understand something, because he was a man who had never needed to understand this particular thing before. And he realized that how he handled the coming hours would determine not only this encounter but the Dominion's relationship with humanity for years to come. He sat at the main strategy table, laid the intelligence file out in front of him, and looked at it as a whole, not in parts. He was trying to find a breach in it, the part that was wrong or exaggerated or misinterpreted. Every intelligence report had a weakness. Every set of numbers had an underlying premise. Scan data is very reliable but not perfect. Perhaps the scan misread the hull composition. Perhaps the weapon performance assessment was based on flawed extrapolation. Perhaps the production figures were inflated. He spent an hour looking for errors. He found a few small ones. The assessment of the mass driver's kinetic output had a margin of error that, under the most optimistic interpretation, could make the actual figures somewhat lower than reported. The production figure of 412 was a minimum, and the actual current number could be lower if production had slowed down. But the gap between these optimistic corrections and the manageability of the situation was still vast. Even if every figure was wrong by 20% in the direction he desired, he was still looking at a single human patrol ship that could destroy his entire armada and withstand the return fire of the armada, supported by hundreds of identical ships and an unknown number of ships above that class, and they had allowed him to see all of this intentionally. That was the part that constantly came back to him, not the capability. Capability is just engineering, just resources, just the accumulated result of a species' technical development. Capability could be matched with time if you worked at it. That was huge and unexpected. But that in itself didn't make him stand by the viewport instead of making a decision. What made him stand there was the choice. They chose to let him look. They decided at some level of their command structure that showing him everything was better than hiding it, that knowing what the Iron Meridian was and what stood behind it would achieve more than any amount of secrecy or maneuvering. This wasn't the choice of a species that feared him. This was the choice of a species that had calculated the outcome of this encounter long ago and was satisfied with all possible outcomes, a species that looked at the Bredh Armada and thought, let them scan us, let them see, let them understand, and then we will see what they decide. A species that then sent a single ship to sit in the corridor and wait with unraised shields, without charged weapons, with 1,847 calm, ready people on board. Yak thought about the 10,000 years in the intelligence file, about the wars, about the weapons capable of destroying their own civilization, about the decision at some point to direct all that energy outward. He thought about what it meant that they had survived all that they had gone through 10,000 years of the kind of internal conflict that had destroyed other species. He knew 3 that had gone extinct because of their wars, 3 that had reduced themselves to pre-technological levels and emerged from it scarred, likely changed, certainly, but whole and still hungry. That was the word that came to his mind as he stood by the viewport, looking at the patient, steady blinking of the Iron Meridian's navigation lights. Still hungry. He turned to Virax. If we fire on this ship, he said, not as a plan but as a calculation, and we somehow disable it before it destroys us, which, as the scan suggests, we are almost certainly unable to do, but let's assume what happens next. Virax answered without hesitation, because he had already run that calculation. 411 ships of the same class, he said. Minimum. Plus whatever is above that class, plus whatever political response there is to military action against their vessel, plus any other species they have relations with, and who will perceive an attack on a human ship as an invitation to reevaluate their own relationships with the Dominion. Yak nodded. He had run the same calculation and reached the same conclusion. And if we do nothing, he said, if we just leave? Virax thought about it longer. Then they successfully demonstrate that we will not fire on them, that the corridor is accessible to them, and news of this encounter will spread, because it always spreads. All the species watching the Dominion's borders will hear that the Bredh arrived in full force and then left, doing nothing. Which tells them what? That the Dominion found a reason not to act, Yak said. Yes, Virax said again, and it tells them that there are things the Dominion fears. Yak looked at the Iron Meridian. There was a third option. There was always a third option. And it was the one that the species that had accumulated 10,000 years of conflict and an unknown number of warships above the Vanguard class apparently hoped he would reach. He went back to the comms station. "Open a channel to the human ship," he said. The operator opened the channel. Yak stood before the comms display and thought for a moment about what he was going to say, and about what it meant that he was saying it, and about the specific sensation of a man who had spent 31 years as the most dangerous thing in any room he had ever been in, and who now stood in a room where that was no longer true. To his surprise, he was able to bear it. He began to speak. The request for communication came over the standard Bredh military frequency. Voss's comms officer, a young woman named Ray who had the unhurried, honed manner of a person who had routed signals under high pressure long enough that nothing surprised her, immediately flagged it and turned to look at the commander. "The Bredh flagship is requesting an open channel." "Commander," she said. "Audio and video." Voss looked at the time display on her console. It had been 47 minutes since the scan finished. She had spent most of that time sitting in her chair, reviewing crew reports, signing maintenance logs, doing the usual administrative work of running a ship because there was always usual administrative work, and because doing it grounded her in the normal fabric of her work. It also sent a signal to her crew: if the commander is reviewing maintenance logs, then the situation hasn't escalated to the point where we should be worried. She closed the maintenance log. "Accept the channel," she said. "Full display. Give them the bridge." Ray opened the channel. The main display at the front of the Iron Meridian's bridge, the wide screen that usually displayed navigation data and sensor readings, switched to show the interior of the Bredh flagship's bridge. And on the Bredh flagship, on the equivalent screen, in turn, appeared the bridge of the Iron Meridian. Voss looked for a moment at what she saw. The Bredh bridge was larger than hers. High ceilings, wide space. A scale that said, "This vessel is built by a civilization that expects to be scrutinized and expects to be impressive." The crew stations were arranged in a pattern radiating from a central platform, and on that platform stood the Admiral. She had seen Yak's image in the intel files. Reality wasn't much different. Tall, gray-blue skin, pale eyes, 4 arms. The kind of face that had been the face of absolute power for a long time and was forever frozen in that expression. He wore the dark Bredh Admiral's uniform and stood on his platform. His lower pair of arms were at his sides, and his upper pair was loosely folded before him, which, as she had read in cultural notes, was a neutral posture, not aggressive, not submissive, neutral. He was carefully choosing his body language. She noted that. She heard him start to speak in Bredh. Then she replied in Bredh. The small pause on the other end of the channel was small, but it was there. And she noted it, as she did everything else, cataloging it into that part of her mind that always tracked useful information. She had spent 8 months studying functional Bredh after receiving the mission assignment. It wasn't a comfortable language for the human vocal structure. Some tonal components were difficult, and she knew her accent wasn't very good. But she was understood, and understanding was what mattered. "Fleet Admiral," she said. Her voice was the same as always, level, measured, not warm, but not cold. The voice of a person who isn't trying to comfort you, isn't trying to threaten you. "I understand the scan is complete." Yak looked at her on his display for a moment before answering. "Complete," he said. "I hope it was useful," she said. Another small pause. "Informative," he said. She let that word hang in the air between them for a moment, just as you let a word hang when both sides know it contains more than it seems. "Good," she said. Then she let the silence continue for a few more seconds, because silence in a conversation like this wasn't empty. It was the surface on which the other side had to decide what to do, and what they decided to do with it said something about where they were. She watched Yak's face on the screen. He wasn't uncomfortable with the silence. He was processing it just as she was. That told her something about him, that he was experienced and controlled and wasn't going to make a move he hadn't thought through. "Commander Voss," he said, and she realized he was using her name and her rank, which, obviously, he had found out before opening the channel, and both were small signals saying, "I have done my research, and I am treating you as an equal. You are in a patch of space that the Dominion of Bredh considers its territory. I know the Dominion's position on this matter," she said. "We do not share it." "No," he said. "I understand. The Helios Corridor is formally unassigned," she said. "Our government's position is that this is open space. We will continue to use it on that basis. Yak looked at her for a moment. She couldn't fully read his facial expression. Bredh facial language differed from human so much that she was working with incomplete information. But she saw that he was doing the same as she, calculating, reading the situation, making a decision about what was real. "You allowed the scan," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, offered as the start of something. She recognized its form. "Yes," she said. "Without raising shields, without any countermeasures." "Yes." Why? She had foreseen this question. She had considered several ways to answer it during the long transit to the Helios Corridor, in the quiet hours before the Bredh Armada arrived. In the 47 minutes of silence after the scan, she had considered answers that were strategic, answers that were diplomatic, answers that were ruses disguised as answers. "Because I was ordered to," she said. He looked at her, and because the order made sense, she added, "He was ordered to." He was silent for a moment. On his bridge, she saw the figures of his officers at their stations. They were all facing forward. They were all, with varying degrees of success, pretending to be occupied with their duties. They were listening to this conversation. "Your superiors wanted us to see what we saw," he said. "Yes. They sent you here, knowing we would scan the ship." "Yes." He absorbed this. He did it in the same careful, methodical way that, she decided, was likely just his basic way of processing information carefully, without hurry, not allowing himself to get ahead of the data. "There are more ships," he said, "like this one." She didn't confirm or deny it. She just looked at him with that same level, neutral expression and waited. He seemed to accept the silence as an answer. "Commander Voss," he said, and in his voice there was something else, not softer, not that, but more intentional. The voice of a man who had made a decision and was now executing it with the professionalism that 31 years of service had built into him. "I would like to know what your government considers an acceptable agreement regarding the Helios Corridor." She had been waiting for some version of this question. This was the real conversation. Everything before this had been a corridor leading here. "This is a discussion for diplomats," she said, "not for a ship commander and a fleet admiral in the middle of the corridor itself." "Agreed," he said. And she was slightly surprised by how quickly he agreed. And then she was completely unsurprised, because a man who had spent 31 years making strategic decisions understood perfectly when a conversation needed to be escalated. "But we can begin the discussion," she said, "right now via this channel, unofficially." He nodded, slowly, intentionally. "What does your government want?" he asked. "A border," she said. "Formal, agreed upon, with the corridor remaining open to both sides, or at least to neutral traffic." "And in return?" he said. "We do not turn this into a problem," she said. She said it quietly, without pressure, in the same level, measured tone she had used throughout the conversation. But she watched his eyes when she said it, and saw what she was looking for, the small, almost imperceptible change that told her the words had hit the mark. On the Bredh Bridge, Second-in-Command Verax stood at his station and listened to the human commander speak these words in his language, in that calm, unhurried voice, and felt the specific discomfort of a person present at a moment that history would later find significant. He looked at the Admiral. Yak's facial expression hadn't changed, but something in his posture had changed very slightly, in a way that Verax, who had served under him for 9 years, recognized. It was the posture of a man who had arrived at a place in negotiations where negotiations become real, where you stop probing the other side and start making decisions. "A non-aggression treaty," Yak said. "A formal border in the corridor. Open transit rights for non-military vessels. That is a starting point. This will need to be presented to the High Council," he said. "For ratification, I can recommend. I cannot commit." "I understand," she said. "I also cannot commit, but I can tell you that our government is prepared to discuss these terms and that we consider the discussion worth having." He looked at her for a long time. "And if the High Council rejects the terms?" he asked. It was a real question, not a threat. A real question that a serious military commander asks when trying to understand the full shape of a situation before reporting it to his superiors. She looked at him levelly. "Then we will have a different conversation," she said. "A different one." She didn't gesture at anything. She didn't look at the Iron Meridian's weapon systems, and didn't wave her hand at the viewport, and didn't do anything that could be interpreted as a display of threat. She just said it in that same quiet, level voice and looked at him. A different conversation. On the Bredh Bridge, Prith sat at his console with the scan results still displayed on the screen. He wasn't actively working. The scan was finished. The data was saved. He technically had nothing more to do. He sat there because he couldn't force himself to leave. He had a sensation he recognized as irrational, but couldn't discard that if he left the console, the numbers would somehow change. And he wanted to stay close to the reality of what he had found. He listened to the conversation between the Admiral and the human commander. He had noticed almost from the very first moment the channel opened that Commander Voss spoke their language without that careful, textbook formality that most non-Bredh speakers used when working from a manual. Her accent wasn't very good. Some tones were clearly difficult for her vocal structure, but the phrasing was natural. The word choice was natural. She spoke Bredh the way a person speaks a language they had practiced with real native speakers, not just recordings and grammar books. 8 months. As he later learned, she had 8 months to learn the language well enough to conduct diplomatic negotiations in it without an interpreter in a high-pressure situation, under the kind of pressure that makes most people's second language abilities collapse. He thought about that. He thought about the 10,000 years in the intelligence file. He thought about a species that had spent all that time fighting and, in the process, learned not only to fight but to prepare, to anticipate, to enter a situation knowing what would happen before it happened, because they had seen enough versions of similar situations to recognize their shape. She had prepared for all of this. 8 months of language study, the decision to open the ship to a full scan. The mission itself. One ship sitting in the corridor, demonstrating by its pure presence and patience that humanity was comfortable in this space and intended to remain comfortable in it. All of this was prepared, all of this was calculated. All of this was executed by a woman who sat in her chair and reviewed maintenance reports while an armada sat outside her ship, because she had run the calculation and was satisfied with what it led to. Prith thought about the result again, classification, unknown by the system that tried to classify the human crew's stress reaction and found nothing. He thought about what that actually meant, not what the result says, but what describes reality. It meant that the humans didn't have a category for what they were feeling that matched one his scanner could recognize. It meant that the emotional and biological state of 1,847 people on a warship was something completely outside his scanner's library of references for known species reactions to mortal danger. It meant they weren't afraid in a way he could measure. He thought about what kind of species this was. He thought about how a species could reach a place where its soldiers, sitting on a lone ship millions of miles from home, surrounded by enemies, were in a biological state that a military scanner couldn't classify because it didn't match any of the known versions of fear. He thought it would take doing this very often. It would take being in situations like this, or worse, so many times that the body stops producing the signals it originally generated for danger, because danger had become a standard operating condition, because their history had made danger the water they swam in. He thought, 10,000 years. He thought that they had survived all of it. On the main display, the conversation between Yak and Commander Voss continued. They were discussing, in the careful, measured language of two professionals who understood what was at stake, and both were committed to not making a mistake, the preliminary conditions of a process that would eventually lead, through a session of the High Council, through months of formal diplomatic exchanges, through the careful, slow work of people with very different personalities trying to find an agreement that they both could accept, to a treaty, not to a battle, not to another species being brought to its knees, not to the quiet, clean ending of an erased species, but to a conversation, to a process, to the long, imperfect, perfectly human method of reaching results by discussing them until something workable emerged. Yak's posture throughout the conversation changed in small ways that Virax noticed, and that probably no one else on the bridge noticed. The small tension in his upper shoulders hadn't disappeared, but it changed, took on a different quality. It shifted from the tension of an unresolved threat, the tension of something that might have to be fought, to the tension of a complex problem he was solving. Another tension. A managed tension. He realized he was going to recommend a treaty. He had run the calculation and arrived at the place where the calculation ended, and the place where it ended was here. A recommendation to the High Council that the Dominion of Bredh conclude a formal non-aggression agreement with humanity. Not because humanity demanded it, not because humanity threatened war, not because humanity had done anything other than sit in the corridor and allow itself to be seen, and then open a channel and speak directly in his language because the math was clear, because the history was clear, because the scan was clear, and because, most importantly, the calm on Commander Voss's face throughout this conversation, the absolute, imperturbable, collected calm of a person who knew from the beginning how all this would go was the clearest thing of all. On the weapon deck of the Infinite Dominion, a young Bredh officer named Doro kept his hand near the primary launch panel. He had been there the entire standoff, 3 steps from the panel, watching the system status indicators and waiting for an order. He hadn't received an order. About 20 minutes ago, he received a signal from the bridge telling him to move to standby mode, not to shut down, but to wait, to keep the systems in a warm state, to remain at his post. But the readiness level was lowered from preparation for an active engagement to standby, which was a step back from the edge. A deliberate, calculated step back. He moved to standby. He stood at his post and watched the Iron Meridian on his secondary display. The human ship did not move. Its weapons were not charged. It just sat there, being exactly what it was, in the same steady, unhurried rhythm it had maintained since their arrival. He thought about the scan results. They had reached the weapons team as a summary, as always, with operational intelligence, stripped of some details, focused on the most actionable points. He had read the summary, he had read the weapon assessments, he had run the same calculation that everyone else on the ship was quietly running. He looked at his hand 3 steps from the panel, and then looked at the Iron Meridian. He was glad, quietly and personally, and in that specific sense of a person who would never say it out loud, that the Admiral was talking, not shooting. He moved 1 step away from the launch panel, just enough so that to himself, to his body, it was clear what the situation was. The channel between the 2 ships remained open for another 30 minutes. Voss and Yak discussed a preliminary structure. They talked about border markers, they talked about communication protocols, they talked about the process by which formal representatives would meet, where, and under what conditions. They talked like 2 people who, through the specific logic of the situation they found themselves in, had come to the understanding that the conversation itself was what the situation required. After 30 minutes, Yak said, "I will submit the recommendation to the High Council." Voss nodded. "We will await their response." Pause. "You will continue to use the corridor during this time," he said. "Not a question." "Yes," she said. Another pause. "Of course," he said. And in the way he said it, there was something not quite despair, not quite acceptance, but some combination of the two, mixed with something that in another species might be called respect, which Prith, watching from his console, found more interesting than almost everything else that had happened over the last 3 hours. The channel closed. The Bredh Armada held its position for another 2 hours. Then, in a sequence that began with the escort ships and ended with the Infinite Dominion, it jumped to FTL and left the corridor. The Iron Meridian remained. Its navigation lights continued to blink, amber, steady, slow in the same rhythm they had maintained from the very beginning. It stayed in the corridor and waited, as it had been waiting all this time, for whatever would happen next. 3 months after the Infinite Dominion left the Helios Corridor, Fleet Admiral Yak stood in the High Council chamber and gave his report. The hall was the oldest room in the Bredh Government Center. It was built from stone quarried on the Dominion's home planet, dark and dense, warming slowly under artificial light. The ceiling was high and curved, and sound in the hall behaved the way it does in places built for power. Voices carried clearly, without echo, as if the hall itself were designed so that all present would hear everything said and have no excuse not to hear. There were 9 high counselors. They sat on a raised arch at the far end of the hall, and Yak stood on the open floor below them, alone, as a commander stands when he is being officially questioned. His arms were at his sides, his posture was correct, military, and expressed nothing in particular. He had been in this room before. He had received praise here. He had been given new commands, new territories, and new power. He had stood on this floor before and always felt the specific satisfaction of a man whose record speaks for itself. This was a different kind of standing. High Counselor Drath sat in the center of the arch. He was the eldest of the 9. With the dark black color characteristic of advanced age in the Bredh, and a face that had spent decades learning to adopt an expression conveying displeasure without becoming clearly readable so that it could be called hostile. He looked at Yak with that expression. "Now you recommend," Drath said. His voice carried across the stone floor without effort, "that the Dominion of Bredh conclude a formal non-aggression agreement with a species that has been in space for 80 years. "I," Yak said, "with a species that violated our territorial border, with a species that contests the validity of that border, which is another matter." Drath looked at him for a moment. "And you recommend this," he said, "based on the scan of 1 ship." Based on what the scan showed, Yak said, which is not the same thing. The counselor to Drath's left, a stout man named Varax, who managed the Dominion's military budget and had an opinion on most matters, leaned forward in his chair. You had 7 ships, he said. The human ship was 1. You are telling this council that you could not resolve the situation while in a position of full numerical superiority. Yak looked at Varax. I am telling this council, he said carefully, that numerical superiority is a calculation, and when I ran the calculation, the result was not what I expected. He paused. I prefer to run the calculation and act on the result than to ignore the result because it is inconvenient. Varax leaned back. He didn't look satisfied, but he didn't push further because Yak's service record was a thing that existed and that everyone in the room knew. To argue with a man who had never lost a single battle about his calculations was a special kind of argument that required more confidence than Varax had. Drath, before this session, had read the scan report. All 9 counselors had read it. Yak had submitted it in full, without a summary, because he felt that a summary would shorten the data in a way that would allow the reader to remain satisfied with their existing assumptions, and he didn't want the counselors to remain satisfied with their existing assumptions. He wanted them to sit with the numbers just as he had sat with them. He wasn't sure it had worked. Counselors, in his experience, were skilled readers of reports in a way that confirmed what they already believed. But he had tried. Let me ask you something directly, Drath said. Were you afraid? The hall was very quiet. Yak considered the question. He considered it seriously, which was the only way he knew how to consider anything. I was sufficiently cautious, he said. Drath made a quiet sound that wasn't quite a laugh. That is a very cautious answer. The situation required caution, Yak said. It required action, said another counselor, a younger one from the military oversight department, one who had never personally been in a position where an opponent's weapon was larger than his own. You had overwhelming superiority. You had legal justification. You had a clear violation of the Dominion's territory, and you decided to negotiate. I decided not to die, Yak said. The hall was quiet again. He hadn't planned to speak so directly. He had planned a more complex answer, something about strategic assessment and the Dominion's long-term interests. But standing in this room before 9 people who hadn't been there, who hadn't seen the numbers, who were looking at this through the prism of what they believed the Bredh Dominion represented, not through the prism of what he saw humanity represented, the complex answer felt dishonest. I decided not to die. It was accurate. You reviewed the intelligence file, he said, addressing the council as a whole, not any individual member. You read what we know about human history. 10,000 years of continuous internal conflict. A species that created a weapon capable of destroying its own civilization and didn't use it against itself. A species that redirected all that energy and that capability and that special ingenuity that comes only from 10,000 years of trying to survive each other, redirected all of that into the stars. He paused. The Iron Meridian, he said. It is hull number 412 inches its class. Above it are 4 classifications. We don't know what those ships look like. We don't know their capabilities. What we do know is that humans decided to show us 412 and a ship in a class they consider mid-range. They didn't send us their best. They sent us what they were prepared to have studied in detail. He looked at Drath. That is a choice, he said. That is a very specific, intentional choice. And what that choice tells me is that everything they didn't show us, everything above the Vanguard class, everything on their shipyards, everything at the highest levels of their military potential they are not afraid to keep hidden because they know that what they showed us is already enough. The room was quiet. He felt the quality of that silence. It was different from the silence caused by disagreement or discomfort. It was the silence of people running a calculation. He let them do it. Humans, he said, didn't come to the corridor to fight us. They came to show us a thing, a specific, selected, calibrated thing. And then they waited until we understood what we were seeing. He looked at the arch of counselors. They are patient. They have always been patient. A species cannot live through 10,000 years of internal conflict without learning patience. They sat in that corridor for days, alone, surrounded by 7 of our ships, and they were not afraid. And that is not the weapon system, not the hull composition, not the 411 other ships of the same class. That is what I have to tell you, having returned from the Helios Corridor. Drath looked at him for a long time. Were they afraid? He said. No, Yak said, and that is more significant to you than technical data. Technical data is important, Drath said. Technical data tells me about their potential, Yak said, Behavior tells me about their nature, and their nature is this. They have been in danger in one form or another for 10,000 years. They have calibrated themselves to it. It is not that they are incapable of fear. I believe they are capable of it. The point is that they have, collectively and individually, trained themselves to function at full capacity in conditions that would degrade most other species, to remain calm, ready, and clear-headed when all around them is a threat. He thought about Commander Voss, who reviewed maintenance logs while his armada sat behind her ship. They are reckless, he said. They are aggressive. They are not the type of danger that attacks without reason, but they are prepared in a way I haven't encountered before for the possibility that they might have to fight, and they have made that preparation, its depth, its scale, visible to us intentionally. He looked at the counselors. The best weapon they have is not on one of their ships, he said. It is the knowledge of what they didn't show us, and they gave us that weapon intentionally, because they know what it does when it lives in an enemy's mind. The vote on the treaty recommendation took place 4 days after the session of debates, at which Yak was not present. He had given his report and presented his recommendation, then returned to his duties because the decision was for the council, and he had done everything he could to inform it. The treaty recommendation passed. 7 votes for ratification, 2 abstentions. Drath voted for ratification. Varax abstained. The young counselor from military oversight voted for ratification, which surprised Yak when he heard about it. Although, when he thought about it, it made a certain kind of sense. That person had never been in a position where a weapon was pointed at him, but he could read the scan report. He could calculate. Sometimes math was enough. Formal treaty negotiations began 41 days after the council vote. They were held on a neutral station in unassigned space, staffed by diplomats, not military, and lasted for 6 weeks. The Helios Corridor was designated as a common transit zone, with formal protocols for Bredh and human vessels. No weapon testing in the corridor, no military buildups within a certain distance of its edges, jointly managed monitoring stations at the entrances and exits of the corridor. It wasn't a perfect agreement. It was an agreement that emerged from 2 sides that weren't entirely comfortable with each other, but that both decided that the alternative to negotiation was something neither could clearly win. It had the texture of a document written by people who were cautious of each other. That was fine. It, in essence, looked like an agreement between species that hadn't yet fought each other, if all participants were careful. On the day the treaty was signed, Prith was in his cabin aboard the Infinite Dominion, which was on a regular patrol in another sector. He had been on regular patrol since returning from the Helios Corridor, doing his job, performing scans of completely ordinary and unremarkable things, submitting reports that didn't alarm anyone. He had kept a copy of the Iron Meridian scan results in his personal files. He wasn't sure why. Except that he found he returned to them the way you return to something that changed your perception of other things as a point of reference, as a marker of before and after. He read in military dispatches passing through official channels that the treaty had been ratified. He read the summary of terms. He sat with this information for a while before returning to his scan data. He looked at the results of the hull analysis, the weapon system numbers, the performance assessment of the mass driver cannons, the reactor data, the list of contents in the sealed lower decks, the 2 words in the corner of the biological analysis section, classification unknown. He had thought a lot about those 2 words over the last 3 months. He turned them over in quiet moments, in the hours between shifts, in that specific kind of thinking that happens when you aren't actively working, but your mind is still moving. He thought about what it takes for a scanning system to encounter a biological indicator it couldn't classify. The system had a huge database. It was calibrated on dozens of species in any situation, under any stress. It had a category for fear, for aggression, for pain, for excitement, for calm. It had subcategories and gradations and extreme cases. It was designed to be thorough, and it encountered 1,847 people on a warship and found nothing in its library that matched. He initially thought it was a scanner limitation, that human biology was just different enough from the species in the database that the system couldn't make the translation, that the markers were there but in a form the scanner didn't recognize. The more he thought about it, the less he was sure that explained it. What if it wasn't a translation problem? What if the scanner found the correct data and just didn't have a category for them because no species he had ever encountered produced that specific combination of biological signals in that specific context? What if the humans didn't produce fear because they genuinely weren't afraid? And the reason they weren't afraid wasn't that they didn't understand the danger, but that they had been in danger in so many forms for so long that their relationship to it was fundamentally different from all other species cataloged by the scanner. What if you can spend so much time in danger that it simply stops causing the same reactions not because you became insensitive to it, but because you adapted to it on a biological level? How you adapt to anything that is present long and consistently enough to become part of your normal operating conditions. He thought about it. He thought about a species that lived in the possibility of its own destruction for millennia, that had pointed weapons capable of destroying civilization at its own cities, and then, at some point, decided to step back from that edge and redirect. Not because the weapons disappeared, not because the danger disappeared, but because they collectively, as a civilization, decided to use all that capability and all that hard-won understanding of what danger is and how to survive it and to use it differently. He thought about Commander Voss and how she sounded over the comms channel, how she spoke in his language, which she had learned in 8 months, in that same level, unhurried voice she used for everything else. How she answered questions directly and without games. How she said a different conversation without needing explanation because the explanation was already present in the room. He thought about the maintenance reports. That detail had reached him from a crew member of the Infinite Dominion who had a contact on another ship that had received it from a message passed through unofficial channels, as details always traveled through military networks from person to person in the gaps between official reports. The human commander had reviewed maintenance logs while the armada sat behind her ship. He found that detail more revealing than almost anything else. Not because it was bravery, not because it was a display of strength, but because it was ordinary. Because it said in the clearest way that the situation everyone else perceived as an emergency, as an event, as something requiring full attention and heightened readiness, she perceived as a Tuesday. Not dismissively, not casually. She was at battle stations. Her crew was deployed and ready. She was absolutely attentive, listening, but also reviewing maintenance reports because there was always maintenance that needed to be reviewed, and because the work didn't stop just because someone was pointing weapons at you, and because the type of person who could sit in a chair and do usual administrative work while an armada decided what to do with her ship was the type of person who had very stable relationships with the possibility that something would go very wrong. The type of person you get from 10,000 years of things going very wrong and surviving. Prith opened his personal journal. He had started keeping it after returning from the Helios Corridor, which he hadn't done before in his career. He wasn't the type inclined to keeping a diary. He was a technician. He dealt with data, readings, with a concrete and measurable world of things that his scanner could tell him. But the scanner turned out to be incomplete in the Helios Corridor. It gave him a result it couldn't classify. And in the following weeks, he found himself trying to make sense of what that meant in a way that required more than numbers required words. He had written a few entries about the scan, about the numbers, about the conversation between Yak and Commander Voss, about the treaty, about things he thought about in quiet hours. Now he wrote another one. He wrote about what he had slowly realized over the last 3 months, which he hadn't understood on the day the scan finished. He wrote, "We looked at them to find out how much they should fear us. That was what the scan was. That was the armada. We arrived in full force. And we scanned their ship and waited for the data to confirm what we already believed, that we were the more powerful side, that the advantage was ours, that the situation was simple." He wrote, "We didn't account for what it meant that they knew we would scan and decided to let it happen." He wrote, "We didn't account for what it meant that their crew was calm." He wrote, "We didn't account for what it meant that the commander was reviewing maintenance reports." He paused. He looked at the wall of his cabin for a moment. Outside, in the space through which the Infinite Dominion was moving at a low cruising speed, the stars held their positions in the dark, unchanging and indifferent, the same as always. He wrote, "The most dangerous thing I have encountered is not a weapon or a fleet. It is a species that has survived everything it did to itself and arrived in the galaxy still ready for more. And somehow, despite all that, or perhaps because of all that, chooses to speak first." He wrote, "They gave us the choice to understand what we were seeing and to act accordingly, or not to understand and find out the hard way. What is the difference?" The Admiral understood. The Council eventually understood. He wrote, "I constantly think about 2 words. Classification unknown. The scanner said it couldn't classify what it saw in that crew, but I think it saw something real. I think it saw what a species looks like when it has gone through enough to no longer produce standard danger signals. Not because it doesn't feel danger, but because it is the place where it has always lived. And you don't panic in the place where you have always lived. You just do your job. He wrote, I looked at them to measure how much they should fear us. He wrote, I didn't understand until much later that they looked back at us, and that what they saw didn't frighten them at all. He closed the journal. He sat in his cabin for some time in silence, with the hum of the ship around him and the stars outside the viewport doing what they always did, staying motionless, keeping their distances, watching everything, and saying nothing. He thought that he felt differently than before. Not more, not less. Exactly, just differently. Like a familiar room feels different after something has changed in it that you cannot quite name. Like a known quantity shifts when you understand it differently than before. He thought about the galaxy, about all the species in it at different stages of development, expansion, and conflict, about young species that stumbled into space and spent their first decades trying to understand how it worked, about ancient species that had existed long enough to think they knew everything that mattered. He thought about humanity. 80 years in space with 10,000 years of war and survival behind them, and an unknown number of ship classes above Vanguard, and a commander who was reviewing maintenance reports in the middle of a standoff. He thought we were not the most dangerous thing in the corridor. He thought we should have known that before we arrived. He thought that now we know. Beyond his viewport, the stars were exactly where they had always been. Light from the nearest star had traveled for years to reach him, and when it arrived, the source was already gone. Everything there was older than it seemed. Everything was further away than it seemed. He stood by the viewport for some time, looking at the darkness and the cold flames scattered across it, and he thought about one ship with amber navigation lights, drifting patiently and motionless in a corridor that belonged to no one, waiting for the universe to catch up to what it already knew. He thought that it had been waiting for a long time. He thought that it was likely already used to it.